Good evening! How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Got my light back on my Gemara so I can see. Last night that bulb was out. I'm so happy. Who's in the house on a Sunday? Paul in the Great Northwest, Shandor in the Bronx, Yosef in Massachusetts, Bella in Florida, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Melissa in Great Neck, Tom in Pennsylvania, Ella's in the house, Marjorie in North Carolina, traveling from Georgia. Joe in the Inland Empire. Welcome, everybody. Big show. We're going to do some catching up. We fell behind last week when Nina and I had a little time off, a little vacation. So today we're going to do highlights from 4 dafs. It's actually a good place to do some catching up. We'll actually be back on schedule at the end of today. But as I mentioned last night, no class tomorrow, Monday, because I'm participating in a charity event for Tomchei Shabbos, very nice organization that provides Shabbos meals for the needy. Okay, so today we're going to cover 4 pages, highlights from 4 pages, dafs 37 through 40 here in Tractate Gittin, the 19th volume of the Talmud. Generally speaking, the laws of divorce, but here we find ourselves in a fairly extended digression. We are in chapter 4, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 3. Mishna number 3. Basically, we got into our digression because the sages and Hillel in particular created certain decrees, tikkun ha'olam. Not tikkun olam, but tikkun ha'olam. So this is translated here in the Koran Talmud as for the betterment of the world, and really means for the betterment of the Jewish world, although some of these improvements extend to the whole world. But we're not talking about rectifying the brokenness of the world generally, rather legal decrees that make Jewish society function better. And among them was the idea that the witnesses on a get, on a bill of divorce, actually sign the get, even though technically by written Torah law, all that was necessary is that the witnesses were there when a properly written get was handed to the wife, and it's at that moment that she receives it that the husband and wife are divorced. Witnesses have to be there for that. But if that get is ever challenged in the future and they can't find those witnesses, it would be a problem. Much better if the witnesses have signed the get. And so later, even if the witnesses can't be found or they have died, they're overseas, etc., at least their signatures can be ratified by people who recognize their signatures. And this is what was enacted. So once we're on that subject, we've also learned about the prosbul. Right, so the prosbul is this idea that the sabbatical year, which comes every 7 years, we still count the years, we measure the years, but when the Jews had sovereignty in ancient Israel, the temple was standing in our midst, and we tithed from the land for the benefit of priests and Levites, etc. So then the 7th year would abrogate, would cancel debts. And so it became very difficult for the poor and the needy to borrow money as the 7th year was approaching, because lenders were understandably nervous that they wouldn't be paid back before the 7th year came and canceled those debts. So Hillel the Elder instituted this device, the prosbul, whereby a lender would lend money to the borrower, but through a legal device, the borrower was understood to then owe the money not to the lender, but to the court. And a debt to the court would not be canceled in the 7th year. The court would, of course, then it would pass through the court and go back to the lender. And in this way, the lenders were protected, and that was really to the benefit of the poor and the needy because they could obtain loans in that situation. So we continue our discussion of the prosbul. Here we pick it up at the very bottom of page 36b. We're going to go into 37a. I'm going to be skipping around in these 4 pages, but as you'll see, we talk about the get almost not at all in these 4 pages. Much more now that we're in this digression of the prosbul and other devices that are related to it, including the bill of manumission of a slave. And we're going to get into a bit of master and slave law as it was practiced in the ancient world. Okay, the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of the word prosbul? And Rav Chisda said it's an ordinance, pros, of bule and bute. Bule, these are the wealthy, as it is written, and I will break the pride of your power. And Rav Yosef taught with regard to this verse, these are the bulaot, the wealthy people of Judea. And bute, these are the poor, who are in need of a loan, as it is written, you shall not shut your hand from your needy brother, but you shall open your hand to him, and you shall lend him sufficient for his need. Therefore, the prosbul was instituted both for the sake of the wealthy, so that the loans they would give to the poor person would not be canceled, and for the sake of the poor, so that they would continue to find those who were willing to lend them money. So this is this is legal policy well executed. Now, Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says orphans do not require a prosbul in order to collect payment of debts owed to them. The court, Jewish law, is always going to be very protective of orphans since they cannot, they might not even understand the law. They might be very young. And so the sages, the courts, the law will be very protective of the orphans. So they don't even need a prosbul. Debts that were owed to their father and now are owed to them as the inheritors don't require a prosbul in order to not be canceled. And similarly, Rami Bar Chama taught in a Baraisa, orphans do not require prosbul, as Rabban Gamliel and his court, i.e. any rabbinic court, are considered the fathers of orphans, meaning that all matters that relate to orphans are already managed by the court. And so you can see you don't even need the prosbul to assign that debt to the court. The court automatically administrates the financial affairs of the orphans, and so debts to the orphans would not be canceled by the sabbatical year. Now, we learned in a Mishna there, in Tractate Shevi'it 10.6, one may write a prosbul only on the basis of the debtor owning land. Very interesting. So if the debtor has no land, then the creditor transfers any amount of his own field to him so that he can write a prosbul. And the Gemara asks, and how much is sufficient to be classified as any amount? And Rav Hiya Bar Ashi says that Rav says, even the amount of land sufficient to grow 1 stalk of cabbage is sufficient. And Rav Yehuda says, even if he lent him a place sufficient for an oven and a stove, one may write a prosbul on this basis. Now the Gemara challenges this statement. Is that so? But didn't Hillel teach? In the Tosefta Shevi'it 8.10, one writes a prosbul only on the basis of the debtor owning merely a perforated pot placed on the ground. And this demonstrates that a perforated pot can serve as a basis for the writing of a prosbul, as it is considered to be part of the ground due to the perforation. The roots can grow out of the hole in the bottom of the clay pot into the ground, and so it's like he owns some land. However, a pot that is not perforated, this cannot serve as the basis of a prosbul. Now you can see that what the sages are doing is creating a legal device for the betterment of the world, but they have to be careful that the legal device matches up with halacha. And so halacha requires for a debt to be secured in some way that it's attached to land. If it's not attached in that way at all, it's going to be a problem to honor this after the sabbatical year cancels such a debt. So the creditor will even give a tiny piece of land to the debtor so that he can secure the debt through a prosbul and not have it canceled in the Shemitah year. I'm reminded for my birthday, I think it was last year, the year before, Nina gave me a wonderful present. It's a square amma, a square cubit in the land of Israel. So literally, we have a piece of land in Israel, about the size of this, maybe a little bit more, a cubit by a cubit, enough to stand in and no more. On Mount Carmel, the place where Elijah the prophet challenged the idolatrous priests of the Baal. It's a wonderful episode in the Bible. And in that location, we own a square cubit of land. So thank God we're landowners in the land of Israel. But, it's symbolic, but we own that tiny little piece of land, right? And you would need at least a tiny little piece of land, even a perforated pot on the ground, enough so that the prosbul device will work. Skip a paragraph. Now, the Gemara recounts a related incident when Rav Ashi would lend money and wish to write a prosbul. He would transfer to the borrower a stump of a palm tree that was still attached to the ground, and he wrote the prosbul based on this. The sages of the school of Rav Ashi would transfer their matters, i.e. their debts, to each other without writing a prosbul by stating, "You are hereby a court, and the debt is given over to you." And Rabbi Yonasan transferred a matter by means of such a statement to Rabbi Chia bar Abba. And Rabbi Yonasan said to him, "Do I need anything else?" And he said to him, "You do not need anything else, as this statement alone is sufficient." Now, one thing that we see here is that the prosbul definitely became an established legal device, and we actually still use it today to ensure that debts between religious people are firmly established as legal debts and would not be canceled by the sabbatical year, since we still know when sabbatical years are. And so, but the nature of the prosbul, by now it has been established exactly what you need to do to create an effective prosbul. But back then, you had different courts in different regions, and the language of the prosbul would vary a little bit between one region and another. Skip a few paragraphs. We learned in a Mishna there, in Shavuot 10:1, that the sabbatical year abrogates debt both for loans that were contracted with a promissory note and for loans that were contracted without a promissory note. So the Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara, disagree with regard to the interpretation of the Mishnah. It is Rav and Shmuel who both say loans that were contracted with a promissory note is referring to loans that were contracted with a promissory note that contains a property guarantee. Loans that were contracted without a promissory note, this is referring even to loans that were contracted with a promissory note that does not contain a property guarantee. And all the more so, a loan by oral agreement, this is canceled by the sabbatical year. By contrast, it is Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish who both say loans that were contracted with a promissory note, this is referring to loans that were contracted with a promissory note that does not contain a property guarantee, whereas loans that were contracted without a promissory note, this is referring to a loan by oral agreement. However, the sabbatical year does not abrogate a loan contracted with a promissory note that contains a property guarantee, as it is as though the creditor has already taken possession of the debtor's land. So very interesting. You don't even need the prosbul if the debt is guaranteed by real property, because if the guarantee is written into the promissory note, if the real property is referenced as a guarantee or as collateral, as we'll see in the promissory note, then you don't need the prosbul, because from the lender's point of view, this collateral or this real property that is mentioned in the agreement, the loan agreement, that specifically says this real property or this collateral will guarantee the loan, well, then the debtor is not able to sell that property while the loan is still outstanding. And for that reason, it's considered as if the lender has already acquired that property. Therefore, the sabbatical year wouldn't cancel such a loan, and the prosbul would not even be necessary in those cases. Skip a few more paragraphs. We're near the bottom of 37a. We learned in a Mishna there, Shevi 10.2, with regard to one who lends money to another based on collateral, and one who transfers his promissory notes to a court, the debt owed to them is not canceled by the sabbatical year. Now the Gemara asks, granted, the debt is not canceled when one transfers his promissory notes to a court, right, to a beis din, to a rabbinic court, as the court seizes the promissory notes and they are able to collect this debt whether or not there's a sabbatical year. But what is the reason that debt is not canceled for one who lends money based on collateral? And Rava said, due to the fact that the creditor has seized an item that belongs to the debtor, it is considered as though the debt has already been collected. Abaye said to him, if that is so, then if a creditor loaned money to someone and he lives in his courtyard as collateral for the loan, since he seizes the courtyard which belongs to the debtor, would you also say that the sabbatical year does not abrogate the debt? That debt, that would contradict the accepted law that in this case the debt is canceled. And Rava said to him, collateral is different, as the creditor acquires it for himself, as learned from the statement of Rabbi Yitzhak. As Rabbi Yitzhak says, from where is it derived that a creditor acquires collateral given to him and is considered its owner so long as the item is in his possession? As it is stated in the verse with regard to the obligation of a creditor to return collateral at night, right? So we have in the Torah, written in the Torah, that if a poor person owes you money and you take his cloak as collateral so that the debt will be paid, but he has no cloak to sleep in at night, then you shall act with righteousness and give him his cloak back at night so he won't freeze to death in the night, he won't be cold at night. And then he can give you the cloak back in the morning. So you have to treat people who are debtors, with love and respect because they are your fellow man. Right, says the Torah in Deuteronomy 24:13, and it shall be righteousness for you. Rabbi Yitzhak infers, if the creditor does not acquire the collateral, then from where is the righteousness involved in returning it? He would simply be returning an item to its rightful owner. And from here it is learned that a creditor acquires the collateral. Therefore, when he returns the collateral to the debtor, he is performing an act of charity. And from this we see that such a loan secured by collateral would not be canceled by the sabbatical year. We learned in a Mishnah there, also in Shavuot, now 10.8, now we're on 37b. In the case of one who repays a debt to his friend during the sabbatical year, the creditor must say to him, I abrogate the debt. So this is the kind of debt that would be canceled by the sabbatical year. Excuse me. But what happens if the borrower, okay, the debt is canceled, but he actually wants to honor his debt? And so even though it was canceled, there was no prosbul, it was the kind of loan that would be canceled by the sabbatical year, but the borrower goes to the lender and says, here, I want to pay back the loan. What do we do in that situation? In the case of one who repays a debt to his friend during the sabbatical year, the creditor must say to him, I abrogate the debt, right? I cancel the debt. But if the debtor then said to him, well, nevertheless, I want to repay you, so then the lender may accept the money from the borrower as it is stated, and this is the manner of the abrogation. And from the fact that the verse employed the term devar, here translated as the manner of the devar of the abrogation, from the fact that the verse employed a term devar that can also mean this is the statement of the cancellation, the sages derived that the creditor must state that he cancels the debt, but he is allowed to accept the payment if the debtor insists on paying. Rabbah said, and the creditor is permitted to lift up his eyes to him, hopefully, demonstrating that he wishes to accept the payment until the debtor says this, that he nevertheless wishes to repay him. In other words, the friend comes and says, okay, I want to pay back the loan. So a creditor who's a pious person, a righteous person, will say, the sabbatical year is upon us, so I abrogate the debt. And the debtor might then say, oh, I see what you're saying. Well, I want to pay anyway, right? You have to say I abrogate the debt, but you can hint with the manner of speaking that legally I'm required to say I abrogate the debt, but I would be happy to accept the repayment of the loan if you will insist, right? And that, in fact, is the halacha. Now, Abaye raised an objection to Rabba's statement from a baraisa. When the debtor gives the creditor payment for a debt that has been canceled, he should not say to him, I give this to you in payment of my debt. Rather, he should say to him, this is my money, and I give it to you as a gift. And this indicates that the debt is repaid only by the initiative of the debtor. Rabba said to him, the creditor is permitted to lift up his eyes to him, hopefully, as well, until the debtor says this, that he gives it as a gift, but the initiative may come from the creditor. It's a little bit similar to on Shabbos. You know, somebody left the stove burning before Shabbos. We'd like to turn it off so the house doesn't get too hot or be in risk of a fire, but we can't. I mean, if it's a true danger, okay, but like, let's just say the house is getting hot. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's not an actual danger of fire, which is a different issue. So we'd like to turn off the stove. We can't extinguish a fire on Shabbos, but we can go and find a non-Jew who happens to be walking down the street. We don't say to him, hey, I'm Jewish. I can't turn off my stove. Will you please come in and turn off my stove for me? But you can say, hi, we're religious Jews. We can't turn off our stove because it's Shabbat. And the person says, oh, could I turn it off for you? Oh, yes, that would be wonderful, right? So you hint at what you need, but you can't say it directly. And then we're going to skip a few more paragraphs, and that brings us to Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 4. In the case of a Canaanite slave that was captured, and Jews who had not owned him redeemed him, if he was redeemed to be a slave, then he will be a slave. And if he was redeemed to be a free man, then he will not be a slave. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, both in this case and in that case, he will be a slave. So we're going completely afield of the subject of divorce and the bill of divorce, and even the prosbul, which at least was linked to matters about the bill of divorce as a tikkun ha'olam. We're just, now that we've been talking about certain rulings of sages and making things clear in a document and what the sabbatical year does, we're going to continue to do some laws that are very loosely related to this subject. So here's Mishnah number 4, talking about the Canaanite slave as opposed to the Jewish slave, right? So in the ancient world, if a Jew couldn't pay his debts, he could sell himself into slavery, which would not be a permanent slavery. It would be a slavery for 6 years, and at the end of that, he goes free, and the master has to even give him what to go out with so he's not broke at the end of his slavery. But a Canaanite slave, that was a different matter. As the Torah said, when we entered the land, right, there were certain Canaanites that could become slaves, and it was really, sort of somewhat spelled out in the Torah, but with room for interpretation, that Canaanite slaves should not be freed. They could be freed under certain conditions, as we'll see, but for the most part, they would not be freed. They would be permanent slaves, and they were dealt with like property, really equated to land, like real property. But what's interesting is that if a Canaanite slave was acquired by a Jew, so then he would immerse in the mikveh, and he would take on certain halachas, certain mitzvahs, certain commandments that apply to Jews and would apply to Canaanite slaves as well. For example, the Canaanite slave of a priest is permitted to eat teruma, consecrated food for the households for priests and their households, that a regular Jew, even a Levite, would not be permitted to eat. So now we're talking about Canaanite slaves. And this idea, right, that what would happen if a slave is freed? What would happen if a slave that's owned by a Jew and the land of Israel is attacked, and the marauding armies, capture the slaves that are owned by Jews and take them away? So at that point, the owner of the Canaanite slave has despaired of getting that slave back. And this concept, Yeush, despair of recovery, is an important legal concept that we'll get to quite a bit later in our journey through the Talmud with respect to lost objects, right? Lost money, lost property, that if the owner has a reason to despair of ever getting it back, so then legally that property becomes ownerless. Well, what happens if a Canaanite slave is taken away in such a manner that the owner despairs of ever recovering that slave, so he becomes ownerless? Does he then acquire his freedom or not? That's the issue that we're looking at here. So here's the Gemara on Mishnah number 4. With what are we dealing here if we say that the slave was redeemed? Okay, so the slave was captured, right, by non-Jews in, let's say, neighboring countries. And then they say, you know what, we have enough of our slaves. We don't really need more slaves. It's just going to be more mouths to feed. And they say, hey, Jews, would you like to purchase this slave that we captured so that we can turn this mouth to feed into more money for us? Say the enemies who invaded the land of Israel and took some slaves. Right, so let's reread the Mishnah. In the case of a Canaanite slave that was captured, and Jews who had not owned him now redeemed him, right? Redeemed this slave that belonged to someone else. So what does it mean that they redeemed him? Okay, so they purchased that slave from the foreigners who captured him in a war. And then what? Then what happens? So if he was redeemed to be a slave, then he will be a slave. In other words, the Jews can purchase that Canaanite slave back so that he will at least continue to be owned by Jews and he can fulfill his obligations as a Canaanite slave. And by the way, that Canaanite slave, he's a slave. There's nothing good about being a slave. But if you're going to be a slave in the ancient world, you're much better off being owned by Jews, because the Torah spells out you have certain obligations to take care of the Canaanite slave that they didn't have in other countries. Recently I read accounts much more recently in history. We're talking about 1700s, 1600s, 1800s. The slaves, Christian slaves that were captured out of Europe and became galley slaves, right? Rowers on the galley ships of the Barbary states. No life on earth could be more hellish, right? They would just row until they die. They would not be allowed to get off their benches in the hot sun, even to urinate or defecate. They would just, slosh in their own filth, barely eat. And when they die, okay, so then they would be unchained and thrown overboard, right? There was no sense of those, owners of those slaves that they had any obligation for the welfare of their slaves. By contrast, Jewish owners had to take care of the slaves in various ways. So, if Jews redeem the Canaanite slaves, and as we see, there's an obligation, just like there's a Torah obligation to redeem Jews that have been kidnapped, that have been captured by the enemy. It's an obligation incumbent on the community to redeem those slaves. Likewise, there's an obligation to redeem Canaanite slaves that had been captured by the enemy and bring them back. The question is, now that they were captured and their Jewish owner despaired of ever getting them back, and other Jews purchased the slave from the enemy, do those slaves return to slavery, just owned by a new master, or have they somehow become freed in this process? And so the Mishnah says, if Jews purchased the Canaanite slaves and their owners maybe had despaired of recovering them, maybe not, we'll see. So then if they're purchased to remain Canaanite slaves, they remain Canaanite slaves. But the Jews who purchased them from the enemy could also purchase them for the purpose of freeing them, and then they would become free. So the Gemara clarifies. With what are we dealing? If we say that the slave was redeemed before the first owner reached a state of despairing with regard to recovering the slave, then even if he was redeemed to be a free man, he should still belong to his first owner, because the first owner never despaired of recovering his property. So why would the Mishnah state that he will not be a slave? Rather, we might say that the slave was redeemed after the first owner despaired of recovering him. Then, even if he was redeemed to be a slave, why will he be a slave? After his owner despairs of recovering him, he becomes ownerless property and consequently acquires his freedom. So Abaye said, actually, the Mishna is referring to a case where the slave was redeemed before the despairing of the owner, and therefore, according to the unattributed opinion of the Mishna, if he was redeemed to be a slave, he will be a slave to his first master. If he was redeemed to be a free man, he will not be a slave, neither to his first master nor to his second master, i.e. the one who redeemed him. He will not be a slave to his second master because he redeemed him as a free man and cannot now demand that he become a slave. And he also will not be a slave to his first master, lest people refrain from redeeming slaves. If they know that a redeemed slave remains a slave of the original owner, they will not see any reason to redeem him from his captivity. And the slave is definitely better off redeemed, even if he returns to slavery under the Jews, to a different Jew, because he's better off being a Canaanite slave in Israel than any other kind of slave abroad. And so where's the halacha on this issue? With regard to a Canaanite slave who was captured and whose owner despaired of recovering him, if he was redeemed to be a slave, then the person who redeemed him is permitted to enslave him. If he was redeemed to be a free man, then he is a free man. If the owner did not despair of recovering him and he was redeemed to be a slave, the person who redeemed him receives from the original owner the sum that he had spent in redeeming the slave. And the slave is returned to his original owner. If he was redeemed to be a free man, he remains a slave of his original owner, and his owner is not required to reimburse the one who redeemed him. And this is in accordance with Rava's explanation. And it is a mitzvah, a commandment, to redeem slaves. If a slave was captured, since he had immersed for the sake of slavery, right? A Canaanite slave owned by a Jew is immersed in the mikvah and takes on the obligations of a Canaanite slave owned by a Jew. And by doing so, he accepted upon himself these mitzvahs that are incumbent on a Canaanite slave. Then he is redeemed just like a Jew who was taken captive. There's an obligation to redeem Canaanite slaves that are captured by the enemy. Now we skip a bunch of paragraphs and we are on page 38a, about a third of the way down. Rav Shemin bar Abba says that Rabbi Yochanan says a slave who escaped from prison is emancipated. He is no longer subjugated to his owner, as it is assumed that his owner has despaired of retrieving him. Right? So this would be some kind of a prison, not like prison like we understand prison. You go to prison, you come out after a year or two. Why would the owner despair of getting him back? But the kind of prison in the ancient world where the guy was never coming back. Right? So there, because the owner despaired of getting the slave back, the slave becomes ownerless. And when he becomes ownerless, he loses the status of being property and he becomes free. Skip a bunch more skip about 4 more paragraphs. Now the Gemara relates an incident. The maidservant of Master Shmuel was taken captive. Some people redeemed her to be a maidservant and sent her to him. They sent him the following message: we hold in accordance with the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, and therefore we hold that in any case she remains your maidservant. Now, even if you hold in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis in the Mishnah, then you should know that we redeemed her to be a maidservant, and even the rabbis would agree that she remains your maidservant, right? So it's this example. Shmuel had a Canaanite female slave. She was captured. Other Jews redeemed her from slavery, but not for the purpose of freeing her, rather for the purpose of recovering her and restoring her to her master, in this case, the sage Shmuel. And the Gemara adds, and they thought that this was before his despair, that Shmuel had not despaired of ever getting her back. But that is not so. In fact, it was after his despair. He thought he would never recover her. And when Shmuel received the female slave, the maidservant, it is not necessary to say that he did not enslave her, but also he did not require her to receive a bill of manumission, as he held that she was a free woman in every respect. So you see there's a distinction. If a slave becomes ownerless, Does he lose the status of being a slave just because he has no owner? Because it might be, okay, a slave is ownerless, a Canaanite slave, but they don't become free. They're just waiting for another owner to step in and claim them. They only become free when the owner who has the right to free them gives them their freedom with a bill of manumission. Right, but here Shmuel says, no, because I despaired of ever recovering her, she was ownerless, and because she was ownerless, she becomes free. Now the Gemara comments, in this matter, Shmuel conforms to a standard line of reasoning. As Shmuel says, with regard to one who renounces ownership of his slave, the slave is emancipated, and he does not even require a bill of manumission. Shmuel cited a proof from that which is stated, but every slave man that is bought for money, Exodus 12:44, does this apply only to a slave who is a man and not to a woman slave? Rather, it means the slave of a man, a slave whose master has authority and control over him, is called a slave since he is the slave of a particular man, a particular owner. However, with regard to a slave whose master does not have authority over him, such as one who has been declared ownerless or one where the master despaired of recovering the slave, this person is not called a slave but a free man or woman. Therefore, once Shmuel despaired of retrieving his maidservant, she was no longer under his control, and he did not require a bill of manumission. Okay, we skip forward some more paragraphs. We're on page 38b. Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says anyone who emancipates his slave violates a positive mitzvah. As it is stated, of them may you take your bondmen forever, meaning Canaanites. This is a positive mitzvah, a positive active commandment requiring that one subjugate Canaanite slaves for their entire lives, and therefore it is prohibited to emancipate them. Right? That's Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel. Now the Gemara raises an objection from a baraisa. There was an incident involving Rabbi Eliezer who entered a synagogue to pray, and he did not find a quorum, a minyan of 10 men. And he emancipated his slave and had him complete a quorum of 10. Now, this demonstrates that one is permitted to emancipate his slave. And the Gemara answers, freeing a slave to enable the performance of a mitzvah, for example, completing a minyan, this is different. This does not demonstrate that in general, one is permitted to emancipate his Canaanite slaves. Now, interesting there, you don't make a minyan with 10 people of any sort, right? You make a minyan with 10 Jewish men. So we're not talking about a Jewish slave here, right? We're obviously, in this discussion, we're talking about a Canaanite slave. So how did Rabbi Eliezer free his Canaanite slave and have a minyan? It must be that at that time, the manner of becoming a Jew was a little bit different than today. And a Canaanite slave who had lived with a Jewish family had already undertaken a bunch of commandments to live by them, then only lacks his freedom to actually become a Jew. If he so chooses, he'll immerse in the mikveh now as a free man and a convert to become a Jew so that he could fill out this quorum. Right? Now, the laws of conversion have changed very much. This is not in any way meant to comment on what the laws of conversion should or should not be today. The laws of the convert are very well established, require study, mikveh, etc. And basically, one who is a proper convert is committing to live, to be obligated in all the mitzvahs, right? And they have to know what the mitzvahs are. That's what makes it a conversion. Now, the Gemara raises an objection to this proof from a baraisa citing this incident that happened to Rabbi Eliezer. Now the sages taught, of them you take your bondmen forever. So this is optional. That's the statement of Rabbi Yishmael, meaning you may keep them in Canaanite slaves in subjugation forever, but you don't have to. That would square with what Rabbi Eliezer did in freeing his slaves so that he could make a minyan and pray that day. Rabbi Kiva says no. Keeping the Canaanite slaves enslaved forever, this is an obligation, not just permitted, but obligated. The Gemara now explains the Gemara's objection to the proof that was given under the story about Rabbi Eliezer. So perhaps Rabbi Eliezer holds in accordance with the opinion of the one who says that it is optional. Therefore, the incident involving Rabbi Eliezer cannot serve as a proof that even those who hold that it is prohibited to free a slave would hold that it is permitted to free a slave to enable the performance of a mitzvah. Maybe that's only according to the view that keeping them enslaved is optional, but for those who hold that it is obligatory, that would not be permitted. So the Gemara answers, it cannot enter your mind to say that Rabbi Eliezer holds that enslaving them permanently is optional, as it is taught explicitly in a Baraisa that Rabbi Eliezer says, of them may you take your bondmen forever. This is an obligation. So even though it's an obligation, he freed his own slave, so it must be that under certain conditions it becomes possible, but generally it is not. So in connection with this issue, Rabbah said, with these three matters, homeowners become impoverished, that they emancipate their slaves, that they inspect their property on Shabbos. They're not really doing work, but their mind is on, what am I going to do to fix my property after Shabbos? It's not really permitted type of activity on Shabbos, within the letter of law, but not good. And people who set their meals on Shabbos at a time of the sermon in the study hall so that they miss the sermon. As Rabbi Chia bar Abba says, that Rabbi Yochanan says, there were two families in Jerusalem, one that set its meal on Shabbos, and one that set its meal on the eve of Shabbos, and both of them were uprooted. One family was uprooted because they caused the suspension of Torah study, and the other was uprooted because by eating their meal on Shabbos Eve, they did not properly distinguish between Shabbos and Shabbos Eve. So in other words, there are matters that might be legally permitted, technically legal, but it's not good, it's not the right way to live, and it can cause you to become impoverished. Now we skip a few paragraphs. A dilemma was raised before the sages in both of these cases where the slave is emancipated after his owner renounces ownership of him, or where the owner consecrates him. Right? So what if the owner of a Canaanite slave consecrates him, says, I hereby consecrate you? Meaning, I dedicate you for holiness. And what that really means is I give you to the temple, right? What does it mean I give you to the temple? Now, there's two ways that you could be speaking. One is, okay, a slave has a certain monetary value. So I'm not giving away the slave. I'm just saying that whatever the slave is worth, I'm going to give that much money to the temple, right, when the temple is standing. And in that way, they consecrate the slave. They're really consecrating the value of the slave. Or perhaps the person means, no, I consecrate the slave. He's no longer mine. Now he belongs to the temple. The temple doesn't want slaves. What are they going to do with slaves? They're going to sell him to somebody else, and then that money will end up right in the temple treasury given to the upkeep of the temple. But did the slave become free when that happened? Right? A dilemma was raised before the sages. In both of these cases, where the slave is emancipated after his owner renounces ownership of him or consecrates him, does the slave require a bill of manumission, or does he not require a bill of manumission? We saw earlier that Shmuel said, if I declare my slave ownerless, then he's free, and I don't have to give him a bill of manumission. But not everybody agrees with Shmuel. Come and hear that which Rav Chia bar Avin says that Rav says in both this case where one consecrates his slave and that case where one renounces ownership of his slave, the slave is emancipated, but nevertheless requires a bill of manumission. And like the get, right, maybe this is where it's similar and why we're studying this subject here in Tractate Gittin, you could have a very, very simple get that was simply witnessed by two witnesses who saw the get given to the wife, and she's divorced. But it would be much better to have a proper legal record where the witnesses have signed it so that that get can't be challenged later. And likewise, if you want to free your slave, much better to give him that bill of manumission so that if anyone ever challenges him, I thought you were a slave of so-and-so. How did you become free? I received a bill of manumission. Here's my legal proof that I am free. Certainly much better for the slave. And so we continue. Now we're going to skip Now we're gonna skip some pages so that this is truly a highlight show of 4 pages. But I'm gonna read you where the law came out on certain discussions. So page 39a, a free man who consecrated himself. Okay, a former slave who is free but consecrates himself. What did he do? One who consecrates himself consecrates only his monetary value. You can't give yourself to the temple for the upkeep of the temple and say, I hereby become a slave of the temple. If you consecrate yourself at any time, whether you're a former slave or never been a slave, you're saying, I will give my value, right? And the Torah specifies values for people that when they say, I consecrate myself to the temple, there's a certain amount of money that you're promising. And it's really just, the amount of money is just based on how old you are and what gender you are. Right? So one who consecrates himself consecrates only his monetary value and owes the temple treasury this amount. It is permitted for him to work and sustain himself as his body was not consecrated, only his value. You might think you can't use anything that's been, if you consecrate an animal and give that to the temple receives the animal. And in the meantime, let's say you consecrated the animal but haven't yet delivered it to the temple to be an offering or to just be given to the temple to do what they want with it. In the meantime, that animal is consecrated and you can't work it. You can't plow it. You can't shave off its wool and sell the wool. It now belongs to the temple and you can't make any use of it. You just have to keep it alive. If you consecrate yourself, you've only consecrated your value, not, your ability to work, etc. We skip a bunch more paragraphs, and the law came out of a discussion toward the end of page 39a. When a convert that has no family dies, and Jews seize his property. Why would they seize his property? So one who converts to Judaism is understood under Jewish law to break off legal ties with his former family. So once he becomes a Jew, okay, so if he marries, if it's a man, a Jewish convert, he marries a Jewish woman, they have children, okay, so his children are his heirs. But if he converts to Judaism and doesn't have children, and he has acquired property in the meantime, now he dies, so who are his heirs? Well, he broke off legal family contact. He doesn't break off contact. Of course, he can maintain loving family relations with his family from before he converted, but they are not his legal heirs, right? So his property now becomes ownerless when he dies, and other Jews, can claim that property because it's ownerless. It's like finding something that is ownerless. So when a convert that has no family dies and Jews seize his property, and that property included slaves, okay, so now those slaves became ownerless. So the adult slaves acquire ownership of themselves automatically and they go free. But if he had slaves who are minors, they can't acquire themselves because they are minors. So they are acquired by whoever takes possession of them first. And this is in accordance with the ruling of most of the early commentaries who accept Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi's ruling that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Abba Shaul. Now we're on page 39b. Again, I'll read you how the law ended up being summarized at the end of a long discussion. When one makes a statement indicating that his Canaanite slave is no longer subjugated to him, he cannot retract it. And the court forces him to write a bill of manumission. So interesting, it seems like generally speaking, you're not allowed to free your slave. But if you do free your slave, they become free. Skip some more paragraphs. A slave can become emancipated as a result of A, a bodily injury, B, or let's say either number one, because he incurred a bodily injury, 2, receiving a bill of manumission, or 3, paying money. He can purchase his own freedom. And he acquires ownership of himself by paying money to his master in exchange for his freedom. In the latter case, once the owner receives the money, the slave is emancipated. And this ruling is in accordance with the Gemara's conclusion and the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, who rules against the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. Skip another page, and now we're on page 40a. Again, time is short. Instead of reading the discussion, I'm going to read to you the halachas, where the law ended up as a result of these discussions. If one writes a document of betrothal for his maidservant, for his female slave, then, although he said to her, become emancipated with this and become betrothed to me with this, it is not a formulation of emancipation. Again, this is why we're finding this law here in Tractate Gittin, which, generally speaking, most people, average people, poor people, never got involved in contracts except their get, right? So, their ketubah or their get. Most people got married and would have a ketubah, and if, they would get divorced, then there would be a get. But we're learning, so sort of by studying this tractate, that, whenever you write a contract, whether for a gift or for freeing a slave or for betrothal or a marriage contract or a bill of divorce, there were certain legal requirements of that document that had to be observed. And this particular formulation for one who owns a female slave and wants to both free her and marry her, if he worded it in this way, he didn't word it correctly and he did not achieve his aim. This is not a correct formulation, and therefore she is not emancipated and she is not betrothed in accordance with the statement of the rabbis. If a slave was married off to a free woman by his master, then that slave is emancipated. The court then forces his master to write him the bill of manumission. This is in accordance with the statement of Rav Ashi, citing Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. And Rabbi Bar Shela explains, some say that even if his master did not marry him off to the woman, but the slave married a free woman on his own in his master's presence, then there is a concern that his betrothal is valid, and this is certainly so when the master himself marries his own maidservant. Also, if a master borrows money from his slave, if he appoints him as a steward, if a slave wears tefillin in his master's presence, or if he reads 3 verses from the Torah reading in his master's presence, then the slave is still not emancipated. We haven't gone through the legal formula to free the slave. But if a master places tefillin on his slave and directs him to read 3 verses of the Torah reading, or directs him to perform any mitzvah that a slave is exempt from, thereby indicating that he views his slave as a free man, then the slave is emancipated. And the court then forces his master to write the bill of manumission to formalize the emancipation of the slave. Now, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia, from the Jewish community in the land of Israel to the Jewish community in Babylonia, he reported that Rabbi Yochanan says, in a case of one who says at the moment of his death, with regard to so-and-so, my maidservant, right? Maidservant means female slave. With regard to so-and-so, my maidservant, my heirs should not treat her as a slave after my death. Now, he didn't say, with regard to so-and-so, my maidservant, my heirs must free her, or right now I free her. But rather, he uses the words, after my death, they should not treat her, or should not treat her as a slave. So did he free her or not? Says the Gemara, the court compels the heirs, and they write for her a bill of manumission. They emancipate her. Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi said before Rav Dimi, my teacher, don't you admit that her children are slaves, right? This maidservant, okay, the heirs of the previous owner need to free her, but her minor children, did they go out of slavery with her? The master meant only that his heirs should not subjugate her excessively. He did not intend to free her, and her children remain slaves. Why then are the heirs compelled to free the maidservant? When Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda came from the land of Israel to Babylonia, he reported a different version of what Rabbi Yochanan says. To quote, in a case of one who says at the moment of his death, so-and-so my maidservant gave me satisfaction, and one should do for her something that gives her satisfaction, then the court compels the heirs to give her satisfaction. And if she will be satisfied only by being emancipated, they must do so. And what is the reason for this? It is a mitzvah to fulfill the statement of the dead. Right? And since he made it pretty clear that you have to do something good for her according to how she defines it, well, if she defines something good as free me, then that's what you do. We skip forward some more paragraphs. There was an incident involving a certain city of slaves. the whole city of slaves, and that the slaves were sold to Gentiles. And when their final Gentile masters died, the slaves came before Ravina and said that since they had no masters, they wanted to be considered full-fledged Jews. He said to them, "Go and return to the children of your first masters and have them write for you bills of manumission so that you will be considered free men in every respect." The rabbi said to Ravina, "But didn't Maimar say that with regard to one who renounces ownership of his slave and then he dies, there is no remedy for the slave? Similarly, if one sells his slave to a Gentile, he no longer has the right to the slave's labor and he can no longer write a bill of manumission for him." Where did this discussion come out? If one declares his slave to be ownerless, then the slave is emancipated, but still requires a bill of manumission. If a master dies before giving that bill of manumission, the heirs write a bill of manumission for him. And this ruling is in accordance with the opinion of Ravina. There was a certain slave who belonged to two partners. One of them arose and emancipated his half of the slave. The other master said, "Now the rabbis of the local court will hear that my slave is half emancipated, and they will cause me to lose him," meaning they will force me to release him, as it is stated in a Mishna on page 41b that the court forces a master to release his slave who has been half emancipated. So he went and transferred ownership of the slave to his minor son, who could not be forced by the court to emancipate him because he's a minor. And that way the slave would remain in the possession of the family. Now Rav Yosef, the son of Rava, sent before Rav Papa the question of what is the law in this instance. And he sent him a response that paraphrased biblical verses. "As he has done, so shall it be done to him. His dealing shall return upon his own head." Paraphrasing Leviticus 24:19 and Obadiah 1:15. In other words, since the master acted deceitfully to circumvent the ruling of the sages, one should deal with him deceitfully. We know that a child is attracted to money. We will appoint a steward for the child who will clarify the slave's market value, and the slave should jingle the dinars, the money, before the child. The child will want the money, and he will decide to emancipate him, and then they should write a bill of emancipation in the name of the child. And this is the law. If someone is trying to deceitfully use the law in order to circumvent the ruling of the sages, well, the sages know the law better than this guy, and they will use all the nuances of the law to achieve what is the equitable result. Another halacha where this discussion comes out, right? So we're on page 40b now. So if a master writes in a document, "I made so-and-so who is my slave a free man," or "he is made a free man," or "behold, he is a free man," or "he should be a free man," and he transferred this document to the slave, then the slave is emancipated. It is not sufficient to express these formulations verbally. A document must be written and given. If the master is on his deathbed, then the verbal statement suffices. However, if the master wrote, "I will make him a free man," and then transferred this document to him, the slave is not emancipated. And this ruling is in accordance with the statement of the group that is given on this page. Now, a different halacha. If a master states, "I emancipated so-and-so my slave," and the slave denies this. Interesting. Why, when a master comes before a court and says, "This is my slave, and I freed him," and the slave says, No, he never did that. I am still his slave." Is this just a hypothetical so we would know how to rule if this impossible situation ever came up? No, not necessarily. You can imagine a situation during a famine, right, where a master says, "I can barely feed myself. I can't feed you. It's enough. Go free." And the slave, it has a slave mentality, right? We had a slave mentality when we came out of Egypt. We didn't know how to be free people. And that's why in the end we had to spend 40 years wandering in the desert so that our children who had been raised in freedom would be the ones that enter the promised land. That slave mentality can really take a person in its grip. So a slave might say, no, my master never freed me. I'm still a slave, because he can't imagine going free and maybe in a famine especially, he wouldn't know how he's going to feed himself, right? So that situation could happen. So what is the result? If a master states, I emancipated so-and-so my slave, and the slave denies this, then there is a concern that perhaps the master did emancipate him via a third party. It's not that the slave is lying, that my master never freed me. It's that the slave doesn't even know. Perhaps the master said to someone else, oh, my slave, yeah, I freed him. And the slave never heard that. So he says, I never heard that, right? So then what do we do? We're concerned that the master might have freed him. However, if the master states, I wrote a bill of manumission and I transferred it to him, and the slave denies this, then the legal status of the admission of the litigant is similar to the testimony of 100 witnesses, and the slave remains in his current state, right? If the slave says, well, my master says he gave me a bill of manumission, but I never got it, we believe the slave. If the master can produce the bill of manumission, oh, maybe. If he can produce witnesses that he gave him, maybe. But if he just says, I gave him the bill of manumission, the slave says, no, you didn't, right? Then we believe the slave. Because obviously, in the general course of things, the slave is speaking against his own interest, so maybe it's true. So the Rima writes that if the master does not retract his statement that he had emancipated the slave, he is forced to write him a new bill of manumission. He can still free him. He's just going to have to write a new bill of manumission, and now he should give it to the slave in the presence of witnesses. Now, what's the slave going to do? He has to go free. If one states, now we're getting away from the law of slaves and to the law of gifts. If one states, I transferred such and such a field to such and such a person, and the supposed recipient states, he did not transfer it to me, then the statement of the original owner is accepted, as it is possible that he transferred it to him via a third party. If one states, I wrote to so-and-so that I transferred to him such and such a field, and I gave him the document, and the supposed recipient denies having received it, then the legal status of the admission of the litigant is similar to the testimony of 100 witnesses. Therefore, the field remains in the hands of the original owner, and he may consume the produce. However, if the son of the supposed recipient states, you did not give it to my father, and the original owner states that he did do so, then the produce is deposited in the hands of a third party until the matter can be clarified. And this is in accordance with the Baraisa and the statement of Rav Chisda and Rabbah. And that actually brings us to the end, and I'm going to take questions and comments now. That brings us to the end of the discussion of Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 4 of Tractate Gittin. And we just did highlights today of 4 pages. And we'll pick it up not tomorrow, no class tomorrow, Monday, because I'm going to a charity event and I just can't make it to class. So we will meet again on Tuesday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. God willing, I'm having an oral surgery Tuesday morning, but as long as I can speak, I will teach the class with God's help on Tuesday evening at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Okay, let's see if we've got some questions that we can take here on pages 37 through 40 of Tractate Gittin. Give me a second while this document reloads. Very good. Jonathan, one of the items I wondered when I read this section, did the idea of enacting these items for Tikkun HaOlam occur because they saw the problems in action, no loans for the poor, divorcees not being allowed to remarry, or they thought it was possible that it could happen and they were being proactive? What a wonderful question. I'm going to guess that they saw it happening, right? Because if they're going to say we need these enactments for the betterment of the world, right, for the betterment of the Jewish community, they don't issue rabbinic decrees lightly. They don't issue them in a vacuum. And if they're only concerned that these difficulties might arise in the future, I don't think that's enough to justify a rabbinic decree because, maybe there's other nuances and other possibilities that they haven't thought of, right? The law of unintended consequences. And so just because you're afraid of one set of consequences, but you're not sure if those consequences will come into being, and you're not sure what other consequences will come into being, you probably wouldn't issue a decree. It must be that the problems were happening, or probably happening for quite a while, and then they enacted those decrees. That's my guess. Tom, were there protections to keep a debtor from losing his land and falling into destitution? Well, I mean, that right, when we had proper sovereignty in the land, the temple was standing, and we had the Jubilee, right, the Yovel. So there we had the fact that sales of land were only until the next Jubilee, and then they would return to their ancestral heritage. That was one protection. Another protection was that if you sold land, there would be a right to purchase it back, usually included in that sale. And certainly under certain situations, your relative could redeem it. Your relative could redeem you if you were sold into slavery to pay off a debt, so that there would be the right to redeem you by your family. We also have this idea that all things being equal, it's not answering your question, but you'll see it's a related idea. If you're selling a piece of property, so you're going to sell it to the highest bidder, right? But your neighbor has a right, by written Torah law, to purchase that property if he's willing to pay the same price as the highest bidder, because it certainly serves your neighbor to have two properties that are contiguous. It's better for him than some other person moving into that property or owning that property. That's all things being equal. On the other hand, if you want to give your house to your child or to some other relative, you want to give it as a gift. So now there's competing interests. So, there were these kind of, matters of equity. I don't know all the nuances to protect people from losing their land and falling into destitution. But we see that there are certain protections in place, but not full protection, right? I mean, it was not a kind of communist society that everyone will automatically be taken care of. Interesting, right? Even at the time that the children of Israel enter the land, and God says, if you live by my laws, I mean, you're going to prosper. The whole nation is going to prosper. And yet, there are also Torah laws that say how you have to take care of your fellow man who becomes poor. Now, is it only that the poor become poor because they're not pious? No, I would not say that. Even when the nation as a whole is operating piously, it might be that pious people, just God ordains for them certain circumstances. We don't understand why, but not everyone is going to be prosperous. There will be the destitute among us. So the Torah has already said, and when the destitute become destitute, it's not that you necessarily have to restore their land to them, but you do have to take care of them in some way. You don't let them starve. We're certainly going to be learning more about that when we get into the center of our journey through the Torah, through the Talmud, in Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, a lot more about property law and, the nuances that go along with that in protecting the poor. Yosef says, can the sages ever uproot Torah law for the sake of tikkun, or would that be paradoxical? Well, we've already seen that in the discussion. Yes, sometimes, like the prosbul seems to, contradict Torah law. Now, can they ever actually uproot Torah law, or is it more that they form a law that on its face seems to violate a Torah law, but in fact is enabling us to observe a different Torah law? Can they ever actually uproot Torah law? I would say this is not, we can't make a general categorical answer to this. Basically, no. How could you ever uproot a Torah law? The whole point of the sages in every generation is enabling the people to live by Torah law, right? And the Torah says you shall live by these commandments, not die by them. But that very justification, you shall live by these commandments, not die by them, means that when conditions change and fulfilling a law that's in the Torah actually becomes so difficult and onerous that people are dying for it or they just can't be observed, okay, then they're going to have to make some modifications. And that's why we have an oral law and an oral law process. So for example, the tzitzis that we wear, right, the Torah says it has to have the blue thread in it, the childless. At a certain point, it became impossible to find the blue, or it became unaffordable for most people because it was so rare and expensive. So then the sages said, you don't need the childless, you don't need the blue thread in your tzitzis, right? And they shall be white. And then over the centuries, that became the law, right? That all the tzitzis were white. In modern times, we believe, or certain, very reputable Torah authorities believe, that we have found that particular sea snail from which we produce the blue dye so that you can have a childless thread. But there are many communities today that do not hold by that, right? And for them, in those pious communities, they would reject having a blue thread in your tzitzis, even though the Torah mandates that you shall have the blue thread in your tzitzis. And other communities, very pious communities, say, no, we have recovered it, and now we can have the blue thread in our tzitzis. So that becomes a machlokas. It's a dispute within the Jewish world. So, these questions, will we uproot a Torah prohibition or a Torah mandate for the sake of observing other Torah laws? Very complicated question, and it really is a case-by-case type of study. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again Tuesday at 6 p.m. Pacific.